A single mom inherited her parents' old house. But what her dog found inside changed their lives forever. She thought it was just a crumbling, forgotten farmhouse. But when her dog started clawing at the wall, she uncovered something no one was supposed to see: a sealed doorway, untouched for decades. Inside was a room frozen in time, with a hidden journal, a chest of children's shoes, and a letter never meant to be opened. Suddenly, her family's past isn't what she believed. Every answer leads to deeper questions. Why was this room locked away? Whose child's shoes were left behind? And what secret could her parents have hidden so completely that even their own daughter never knew the truth? Because this discovery doesn't just reveal the past, it could rewrite her entire future. So, what did the dog really uncover, and how will it change everything she thought she knew about her family? Let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe before you leave. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the winding country road as Grace Whitmore's old sedan rumbled along, packed to the brim with their belongings. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. In the rearview mirror, she caught glimpses of 10-year-old Daniel's face pressed against the window, his blue eyes wide with wonder at the passing farmland. Buddy, their golden retriever, had his head stuck out the back window, his ears flapping in the wind. The sight made Grace smile despite her worries. At least someone was enjoying this uncertain journey. "Mom, look at all the horses," Daniel called out, pointing to a distant pasture. "Will we have horses too?" Grace swallowed hard. "Not right away, honey. We need to fix up the house first." Her mind wandered to their dwindling bank account and the stack of unpaid bills stuffed in her purse. The inheritance of her parents' farmhouse had come just in time, though the thought of living in her childhood home brought a mix of gratitude and dread. But maybe someday? Daniel's hopeful voice tugged at her heart. "Maybe someday," she answered softly, though she wasn't sure how they'd manage even basic repairs. The last time she'd visited the farmhouse was 5 years ago, and it hadn't been in good shape then. As they turned onto the gravel driveway, the old 2-story farmhouse came into view. Grace's stomach tightened. The white paint was peeling badly, showing gray wood underneath. Weeds had taken over what used to be her mother's flower garden, and the front porch sagged noticeably to one side. "It looks like a haunted house," Daniel exclaimed, his voice filled with excitement rather than fear. "This is so cool," Buddy barked in agreement, tail thumping against the back seat. Grace parked in front of the house and took a deep breath. "All right, troops, let's check out our new home." Daniel scrambled out of the car, Buddy close behind him. Grace followed more slowly, fishing the old house key from her pocket. The front steps creaked under her feet, and she silently prayed they wouldn't give way. The key stuck in the lock at first, requiring some jiggling before the door finally swung open with a loud groan. The musty smell hit them immediately, making Grace wrinkle her nose. Dust motes danced in the beam of sunlight that streaked through the dirty windows. "It's kind of dark in here," Daniel observed, his voice echoing slightly in the empty front room. Buddy sniffed around the baseboards, his tail wagging more slowly now. "The electricity might take a while to turn on," Grace explained, making a mental note to call the utility company first thing tomorrow. She moved through the house, cataloging everything that needed attention. The living room furniture was still there, covered in sheets that had once been white, but were now gray with dust. The floral wallpaper, which had been a next time, outdated even in her childhood, was peeling away from the walls in long, curling strips. A water stain spread across one corner of the ceiling like a dark cloud. In the kitchen, cabinet doors hung crooked on their hinges. The ancient refrigerator stood silent and empty, its seal cracked with age. The linoleum floor was worn through to the subflooring in spots, especially in front of the sink. "Can I explore upstairs?" Daniel called from the hallway, where he was throwing a small ball for Buddy to chase. "Wait for me," Grace answered. "We should check it together." The old house's condition was worse than she'd expected, and she wanted to make sure the upper floor was safe. They climbed the stairs together, each step accompanied by a chorus of creaks and groans. Grace held her breath until they reached the landing, relief washing over her when the stairs held firm. The upstairs hallway stretched before them, with 4 closed doors leading to various bedrooms and a bathroom. Grace's old room was at the far end, and she felt a strange reluctance to open that door just yet. "Which room can be mine?" Daniel asked, bouncing on his toes with excitement. Grace opened the door to what had been the guest room. It was the smallest bedroom, but also the most neutral, with pale blue walls that were mostly intact. "How about this one? It gets good morning light." Daniel darted inside, Buddy following close behind. "This is perfect. Look, Buddy, I can see the whole backyard from here. While Daniel explored his new room, Grace continued her inspection. The bathroom needed serious work, the tiles were cracked, and the fixtures were corroded. Her parents' old room was musty but stable, and she decided it would do for her own bedroom once she gave it a thorough cleaning. As the sun began to set, the house grew darker. Grace dug through their boxes until she found the camping lanterns she'd packed, knowing they might need them. The warm glow helped make the house feel less abandoned, though shadows still lurked in the corners. "I'm hungry," Daniel announced, his voice echoing through the empty house. Grace set up their camping stove on the kitchen counter, grateful she'd thought to bring it. "How about some soup?" she asked, pulling out cans from a box of groceries. She'd packed enough non-perishable food to get them through the first few days. "Can we pretend we're camping?" Daniel asked, sitting cross-legged on the floor with Buddy beside him. "Sure," Grace smiled, trying to keep her voice light. "It's an indoor camping adventure." They ate chicken noodle soup from paper bowls, sitting on the floor because the kitchen chairs looked too rickety to trust. The lantern cast a warm circle of light around them, making their little family feel like an island in the darkness. After dinner, Grace helped Daniel set up his sleeping bag in his new room. She'd brought air mattresses, but they'd save those for tomorrow. Tonight, camping style would have to do. "Good night, honey," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "Sweet dreams." "Night, Mom." Daniel yawned, already half asleep. Buddy curled up beside him, a faithful guardian. Grace made her way back downstairs, carrying one of the lanterns. In the kitchen, she sank into the one chair she tested and found stable enough to use. The lantern's light barely reached the corners of the room, leaving most of the kitchen in darkness. Sitting alone in the quiet house, Grace felt the full weight of their situation settle onto her shoulders. The house needed so much work, and their savings were almost gone. She had no idea how they would manage, but they had to 2%, there was nowhere else to go. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped her arms around herself. The darkness seemed to press in around her little circle of lantern light, filled with memories of harder times and uncertain futures. But as scared as she felt, Grace knew she had to find a way forward. Daniel and Buddy were counting on her, and this old house, despite its problems, was their last chance at a real home. The early morning sun painted golden stripes across the farmhouse's worn wooden floors. Grace stood at the kitchen counter, carefully pouring hot water over coffee grounds in their camping filter. The rich aroma helped mask the musty smell that still lingered in the house. She'd slept fitfully on her sleeping bag, but the morning light made everything seem more manageable. Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor, still in his pajamas with rockets printed on them. He was sneaking pieces of his breakfast toast to Buddy, who waited patiently beside him with hopeful brown eyes. "I saw that," Grace said, hiding her smile behind her coffee mug. "Buddy has his own food, honey. But he likes toast better," Daniel protested, scratching behind Buddy's ears. "Don't you, boy?" Buddy's tail thumped against the floor in agreement, making both Grace and Daniel laugh. The sound echoed through the empty house, somehow making it feel a little more like home. After breakfast, Grace tied her dark hair back with a bandana and pulled on work gloves. "Okay, troops," she announced, "Operation Cleanup starts now." She began in the kitchen, wiping years of grime from the countertops while Daniel helped by dusting the lower cabinets he could reach. Buddy followed them from room to room, his nails clicking on the wooden floors. The morning passed quickly as they worked their way through the first floor. Grace found herself sorting through memories as she cleaned. The chip in the kitchen doorframe from when she tried to roller skate indoors. The height marks penciled on the wall showing her growth through elementary school. They had just moved into the dining room when Buddy's behavior suddenly changed. The golden retriever's ears perked up, and he trotted to a section of wall where the plaster had cracked in a spider web pattern. He began scratching at it intently, his tail straight and alert. "Buddy, no," Grace called. "Come here, boy." But Buddy ignored her, something he rarely did. He whined softly, pawing at the wall with growing urgency. "What's wrong with him, Mom?" Daniel asked, abandoning his dusting cloth to watch. Grace approached the wall, curious about what had caught Buddy's attention. The plaster here was different from the rest of the room, newer, though still decades old. She ran her fingers over the cracks Buddy had been scratching at. "Hold on," she murmured, tapping the wall with her knuckles. The sound was hollow, distinctly different from the solid thud she heard when she knocked on the adjacent section. Daniel pressed his ear against the wall. "It sounds empty inside." Grace's heart began to beat faster. She'd heard stories of old houses having hidden spaces, but she'd never imagined. "Wait here," she said, heading to the box of tools. she'd brought for basic repairs. She returned with a hammer and a flashlight, her curiosity now fully awakened. "Stand back, sweetie," she instructed Daniel, who moved to the doorway with Buddy. Grace began carefully, tapping the hammer against the cracked plaster. Small pieces fell away, revealing more cracks underneath. She worked slowly, methodically, not wanting to damage whatever might be behind the wall. As she pulled away larger chunks of plaster, dust filled the air, dancing in the sunlight streaming through the dining room windows. Daniel sneezed, and Buddy barked in response, his tail wagging with increasing excitement. "Mom, look!" Daniel pointed as Grace cleared away more debris. The outline of a doorway began to emerge, narrow but definitely man-sized. The edges were rough where it had been sealed up, probably many years ago. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she cleared the last bits of plaster from the opening. Behind the wall was darkness, a space they hadn't known existed until this moment. The air that drifted out was cool and stale, carrying the weight of long-buried secrets. Grace and Daniel's eyes met, sharing a look of surprised wonder. Buddy's excited barking echoed through the house as he stared intently into the dark opening, his tail wagging furiously, as if he'd just made the discovery of a lifetime. Dust motes swirled in the air between them and the mysterious doorway, catching the morning sunlight like tiny stars. While they stood frozen in that moment of discovery, the old farmhouse suddenly feeling like a place full of unexpected possibilities. Grace stood before the darkened doorway, her flashlight beam cutting through years of undisturbed air. Dust particles danced in the light, swirling like tiny constellations. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she gathered her courage to step through. "Can I come too, Mom?" Daniel bounced on his toes beside her, practically vibrating with excitement. "Please?" Grace shook her head firmly. "Not yet, honey. I need to make sure it's safe first." She knelt down to his level, meeting his disappointed eyes. "I need you to be my backup, okay? Stay here with Buddy and keep watch." Daniel's shoulders slumped, but he nodded, wrapping an arm around Buddy's neck. The golden retriever sat obediently, though his tail still wagged with interest at the mysterious opening. "If I call out, you run to get Mrs. Martinez next door," Grace instructed, referring to their elderly neighbor she'd met earlier that morning. "Promise?" "I promise," Daniel said solemnly, though she could see the adventure gleaming in his eyes. Grace took a deep breath and clicked on her flashlight. The beam seemed weak against the thick darkness beyond the doorway. She had to turn sideways to squeeze through the narrow opening, her shirt catching slightly on the rough edges of the broken plaster. The air inside was heavy with age, carrying a musty sweetness that tickled her nose. Grace swept her flashlight beam across the space, revealing a room about 10 feet square. Her breath caught as the light illuminated what lay before her. The hidden chamber was like stepping into a time capsule. Sheets draped over what appeared to be furniture created ghost-like shapes in the darkness. A thick layer of dust covered everything, undisturbed for what must have been decades. Cobwebs stretched between the ceiling and walls like delicate lace. "What do you see?" Daniel's voice drifted in from the doorway. "Furniture," Grace called back, her voice sounding muffled in the enclosed space. "And some other things. Stay there, sweetie." She moved carefully into the room, her footprints marking the dusty wooden floor. The beam of her flashlight revealed a mirror on one wall, its silver surface clouded with age. Grace's reflection looked pale and uncertain in its murky depths. With trembling fingers, she reached for one of the dust sheets. The fabric was stiff with age, crumbling slightly at her touch. She pulled it back carefully, revealing an old armchair, upholstered in faded blue velvet. Another sheet covered what proved to be a small writing desk, its surface scattered with yellowed papers. But it was the wall that drew her attention next. There, hanging in tarnished frames, were family portraits she'd never seen before. Grace moved closer, wiping dust from the glass with her sleeve. The faces that emerged were both familiar and strange. She recognized her grandmother as a young woman, but the man standing beside her wasn't her grandfather. "Mom?" Daniel's voice carried a note of concern. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she assured him, though her voice shook slightly, "just looking at some old pictures." Her flashlight beam caught something else, a large wooden chest pushed against the far wall. Unlike the furniture, it wasn't covered by a sheet. The dark wood gleamed dully in the light, brass fittings green with age. Grace approached it slowly, as if it might disappear like a mirage. The chest wasn't locked. The lid creaked as she lifted it, releasing another wave of that sweet, musty smell. Inside, she found more papers, old clothing, carefully folded, and what looked like military medals wrapped in tissue paper. On a small table beside the chest, something made her pause. A leather-bound book lay there, its spine cracked with age but still intact. Grace picked it up carefully, brushing away the dust. In faded gold letters, she read the name that would change everything: Maverick Whitmore. She stared at the name, her mind racing. Whitmore was her family name, but she'd never heard of anyone called Maverick. Not once in all the family stories her parents had told. Not in any of the genealogy research she'd done for a school project years ago. Beside the journal lay an envelope, yellowed with age but sealed with red wax. The same name was written across it in elegant handwriting: Maverick Whitmore. Grace's hands trembled as she gathered both items. She took one last look around the room, knowing she'd need to come back and properly examine everything else. But right now, these two items seemed to call to her with an urgency she couldn't explain. She backed carefully out of the chamber, emerging into the dining room, where Daniel and Buddy waited anxiously. Dust covered her clothes, and cobwebs clung to her hair, but she barely noticed. Her attention was fixed on the items in her hands. "What did you find?" Daniel asked, pressing against her side to peek at her discoveries. Grace sank into one of the dining room chairs, laying the journal and envelope on the table before her. Buddy put his head in her lap, sensing her confusion and offering comfort. She traced the name on the journal with one finger, leaving a clear line in the dust. Maverick Whitmore, a hidden room. A secret relative. Why had her parents never mentioned him? What other secrets lay buried in this old house? The afternoon sunlight streamed through the dining room windows, illuminating the mysterious items on the table. Grace sat there, staring at the name that had been hidden away for so long, while questions multiplied in her mind like the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams around her. Shadows lengthened across the farmhouse kitchen as evening crept in. Grace moved methodically around the room, lighting candles and placing them strategically on the counter, table, and windowsill. The warm glow created little islands of light in the growing darkness, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Daniel sat at the worn kitchen table, pencils scratching against paper as he worked on his math homework. "Mom, can you check this problem?" "Just a minute, sweetie." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she settled into the chair across from him, carefully placing Maverick's journal on the table. The leather binding felt smooth beneath her fingers, worn soft by years of use. Buddy lay at her feet, his steady presence comforting in the quiet room. She opened the journal carefully, mindful of its age. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, though the ink had faded to a warm sepia. The first entry was dated June 15th, 1942. "Tonight, I write by candlelight again." Grace reads silently. "The blackout rules grow stricter each week. Sometimes I imagine I can hear the distant drone of enemy planes, though I know they cannot reach us here. Still, fear has a way of playing tricks on the mind." As she turned the pages, Maverick's world began to emerge. He wrote about working the farm during the day, about news from the war front, about nights spent listening to the radio for updates. But there was something else threaded through his words: attention, a sense of holding something back. "Strange," Grace murmured, drawing Daniel's attention. "What's strange, Mom?" "He keeps mentioning going to the barn late at night." "Listen to this entry. Another midnight journey to check on things. Must be more careful. Sarah noticed the light last time. Cannot risk discovery, not now." Daniel leaned forward, homework forgotten. Maybe he was hiding something cool, like treasure. Grace smiled at his enthusiasm, but her heart beat faster as she continued reading. The entries grew more anxious as months passed. Maverick wrote about precious cargo and terrible choices, about doing what's right despite the consequences. A loose page slipped from between the journal's pages, an unsealed envelope, yellowed with age. Addressed to Margaret Whitmore. Grace's breath caught. Margaret was her mother's name. "Daniel," she said softly, "why don't you go upstairs and get ready for bed? I'll be up in a few minutes to tuck you in." Once Daniel had trudged upstairs, Grace returned to the hidden room, flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. The chest stood waiting, its dark wood gleaming dully. She opened it again, this time taking more time to examine its contents. Beneath the papers and clothing, her light caught something small and metallic. A locket, tarnished but still beautiful, lay nestled in a scrap of velvet. Grace's hand shook as she opened it. Inside were two photographs, carefully preserved. The first showed a woman she didn't recognize, young and beautiful, smiling directly at the camera. The second made her gasp, a little girl of perhaps 4 or 5 years old, her mother's features unmistakable even in childhood. Next to where the locket had lain, she found something that made her throat tight, a pair of tiny leather shoes, barely big enough for a toddler. They were well made but well worn, the leather soft and creased with use. A child had worn these shoes, had taken first steps in them, had been loved. Grace carried her discoveries back to the kitchen, laying them beside the journal. The candles had burned lower, their flames reflected in the window glass like distant stars. She could hear Daniel moving around upstairs, the familiar sounds of him getting ready for bed. With trembling fingers, she opened the letter addressed to her mother. The paper was thin, delicate as moth wings. The ink had faded but remained legible. My dearest Margaret, by the time you read this, you may already know the truth. The secrets I've kept were never meant to protect myself, but to protect those I love most dearly. During these dark days of war, I've learned that love sometimes requires terrible sacrifice. Grace couldn't read further, the words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She stared at the items spread before her, the journal recording long nights of fear and secrecy, the locket with its hidden photographs, the tiny shoes that spoke of a child's presence, and this letter that promised answers, but raised even more questions. Why would my parents hide this from me? She whispered into the quiet kitchen. The candle flames flickered as if in response, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Buddy whined softly and lifted his head, placing it gently on her lap. His warm weight anchored her as questions swirled through her mind like autumn leaves in a storm. The house creaked and settled around her, its old bones holding tight to secrets decades in the keeping. Somewhere upstairs, Daniel called out, "Good night, Mom." His voice, young and clear, cut through the weight of the past pressing down on her. Grace sat motionless in the candlelight, one hand resting on Buddy's head, the other touching the faded ink of Maverick's words. The shadows grew longer, and the candles burned lower, but still she sat, surrounded by fragments of a history she'd never known existed, trying to make sense of the mystery her parents had taken to their graves. The morning sun painted long shadows across Main Street as Grace walked Daniel to the bus stop. Her son's backpack bounced with each step, packed with his lunch and homework from the night before. Buddy trotted alongside them, his golden fur gleaming in the early light. "Remember to ask Mrs. Peterson about the science fair," Grace reminded Daniel, adjusting his jacket collar. The autumn air held a crisp chill that hinted at the coming winter. "I will." Daniel grinned, revealing the gap where his front tooth had fallen out last week. "Are you going to look for more stuff about that mystery man today?" Grace nodded, squeezing his hand. "I'm going to the library to see what I can find out about Maverick Whitmore. Maybe someone in town remembers him." The yellow school bus appeared around the corner, its brakes squeaking as it pulled up to the curb. Daniel gave Grace a quick hug and scratched Buddy behind the ears before climbing aboard. Grace watched until the bus disappeared, then turned toward the library, its brick facade weathered by decades of sun and rain. Inside, the library smelled of old books and furniture polish. Morning light streamed through tall windows, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. The circulation desk stood empty, but Grace heard movement among the shelves. "Hello?" she called softly. "Mr." Jennings emerged from between two towering bookcases, wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. His cardigan had seen better days, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Can I help you find something?" "Yes, I hope so." Grace approached the desk. "I'm Grace Whitmore. My parents were Margaret and James Whitmore. I'm looking for information about someone who might have lived here during World War II, Maverick Whitmore." Mr. Jennings' eyes lit up with recognition. Maverick Whitmore. Now, there's a name I haven't heard in years. He gestured for Grace to follow him. "Come with me. We keep the town records in the reference section." They wound their way through the library to a quiet corner where filing cabinets lined the walls. "Mr." Jennings pulled out a drawer marked 1940 through 1945 with practiced ease. "Maverick was quite active in the community before he disappeared, Mr." Jennings said, thumbing through files. "Used to volunteer at First Methodist every Sunday. Taught woodworking to the boys at the youth center too. Everyone wondered what happened to him." Grace leaned forward. "Disappeared?" Mr. Jennings extracted several yellowed newspaper clippings. "Sometime in 1943, if I remember correctly. Just stopped showing up places. Some thought he'd enlisted, but there was never any official word." He laid the clippings on a nearby table. Grace saw Maverick's name mentioned in various community announcements, church picnics, volunteer work, town meetings. In one photograph, a tall man stood among a group of boys, showing them how to use a hand plane. His face was turned away from the camera, but something in his stance reminded Grace of her father. "My parents never mentioned him," Grace said, studying the articles. "I found his journal hidden in their house, but I had no idea he even existed until yesterday." Mr. Jennings raised his eyebrows. "Interesting. He was your father's uncle, you know. Bit of a black sheep in the family, from what I gathered, though no one ever said why." Grace's hand stilled on the papers. My father's uncle? But why would they hide that? Small towns keep their secrets. Mr. Jennings moved to another filing cabinet. Let me see what else I can find. Over the next 2 hours, they pieced together fragments of Maverick's life in town. Church bulletins listed him as a regular volunteer. Town meeting minutes recorded his suggestions for improving the youth center. A feature article in the local paper praised his work teaching carpentry skills to underprivileged boys. He seems like he was a good man, Grace said, reading through another article. Oh, he was, Mr. Jennings nodded. Always had time to help others. That's what made his disappearance so strange. It wasn't like him to just leave without a word. Grace noticed the librarian's expression grow thoughtful. Do you remember him personally? I was just a boy then, but yes. He once made me a wooden toy car when mine broke. Spent an whole afternoon showing me how he did it too. Mr. Jennings smiled at the memory. That's the kind of person he was. Always taking time for children, making sure they felt seen and valued. Grace thought of the tiny shoes she'd found in the chest. Her heart beat faster as she considered their possible significance. Mr. Jennings helped her make photocopies of all the relevant articles and documents. The stack wasn't large, but it painted a picture of a man deeply involved in his community, until he suddenly wasn't. Thank you for your help, Grace said, gathering the papers. If you think of anything else about Maverick, would you let me know? I'm staying at my parents' old farmhouse. Of course. Mr. Jennings walked her to the door. You know, it's funny. I always thought there was more to his story. Something in his eyes sometimes, like he was carrying a heavy burden. But he never spoke of it, at least not to me. The afternoon sun had begun its descent when Grace returned home. Buddy greeted her with enthusiastic tail wagging. Following her to the dining room table where Maverick's journal still lay, she placed the photocopied articles beside it, arranging them chronologically. The papers told a story of a man who cared about his community, who worked to make children's lives better, who showed up reliably until one day he didn't. But they didn't explain why her parents had sealed away all trace of him, or why his journal spoke of midnight secrets and precious cargo. Grace sat down, running her fingers over the leather cover of the journal. The late afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating the dust still floating in the air from yesterday's discovery. She had more pieces of the puzzle now, but the complete picture remained stubbornly out of reach. In less than an hour, she would need to leave to pick up Daniel from the bus stop. But until then, she had time to dig deeper into the mystery of Maverick Whitmore, the uncle she'd never known, the man who'd vanished, and the secret her parents had taken such pains to Maverick Whitmore crossed. Conceal. The evening settled over the farmhouse like a soft blanket, bringing with it a chorus of crickets and the gentle rustling of leaves. Grace finished drying the last dinner dish while Daniel sprawled on the living room floor, absorbed in his homework. The discoveries of the day churned in her mind, demanding answers. Daniel, honey, she called out, I'm going to visit our neighbor for a little while. Will you be okay here by yourself? Daniel looked up from his math book. Can I watch TV? For 1 hour, Grace agreed, grateful the electricity was working tonight. Then straight to bed, okay? I won't be long. She grabbed Maverick's journal from the dining room table and whistled for Buddy. The golden retriever bounded to her side, tail wagging. Together, they stepped out into the cooling air. Mrs. Callahan's house sat just down the dirt road, a weathered white farmhouse that had seen better days but still stood proud. Warm light glowed from the windows, and smoke curled from the chimney despite the mild evening. Grace remembered her parents mentioning that Mrs. Callahan had lived here for over 70 years. As they approached the front porch, Buddy's nails clicked against the wooden steps. Before Grace could knock, a creaky voice called out, "Door's open, come on in." Grace pushed open the screen door, to find Mrs. Callahan settled in a worn armchair, knitting needles clicking steadily in her hands. The room smelled of wood, smoke, and fresh-baked cookies. At 92 years old, the elderly woman's hands might have been gnarled with arthritis, but her blue eyes remained sharp as tacks. "Well, if it isn't Henry and Marie's girl," Mrs. Callahan said, setting aside her knitting. "About time you came to visit, and who's this handsome fellow?" She reached out to pat Buddy, who immediately sat beside her chair, tail thumping against the floor. "This is Buddy," Grace said, settling onto the floral print sofa. "Thank you for having us so late, Pshaw. I'm up until midnight most nights. Can't sleep worth a darn anymore." Mrs. Callahan studied Grace's face. "You look just like your mama, you know. Except around the eyes, those are pure Henry." Grace clutched the journal in her lap. "Mrs. Callahan, I was hoping to ask you about someone who used to live here. During World War II. World War II? The older woman's eyes sparkled with interest. Lord, I remember those days clear as yesterday. The rationing, the Victory Gardens, all those young men shipping out. She paused. Who are you asking about? Maverick Whitmore. Grace watched Mrs. Callahan's face carefully. Did you know him? The elderly woman's knitting needles stilled completely. Maverick? Now there's a name I haven't heard spoken in years. She looked toward the window, as if seen into the past. He was your daddy's uncle, you know. I just found out today. My parents never mentioned him. No, they wouldn't have. Mrs. Callahan clicked her tongue. Too much scandal. Too many whispers. Small towns love their gossip, and there was plenty going around about Maverick back then. Grace leaned forward. What kind of scandal? Well, it started with that soldier. Mrs. Callahan reached for a cookie from a plate on the side table, offering one to Grace. Showed up in town sometime in 1943, looking worse for wear. Said he'd been injured in training, needed somewhere quiet to recover. Maverick took him in, let him stay at the farmhouse. The farmhouse? You mean where we're living now? That's right. Maverick lived there before your parents did. Mrs. Callahan's voice dropped slightly. He and that soldier got awful close. Spent all their time together, always whispering about something. The soldier never seemed to get any better though. Still walked with a limp months later. Grace's heart beat faster. Do you remember the soldier's name? James, I think. Or maybe John. Memory's not what it used to be. Mrs. Callahan shook her head. But I remember how people talked. Wasn't natural, they said, two grown men living together like that. And Maverick started acting strange, taking late-night drives, buying extra supplies. Someone swore they saw him carrying baby things into the house one night. Grace thought of the tiny shoes in the chest. What happened to them? That's the mystery, isn't it? Mrs. Callahan reached down to scratch Buddy's ears. One day, they were just gone. Both of them. Some said Maverick had been helping people escape something, saving them, if you will. Others thought maybe he'd gotten into trouble with the law. But nobody ever knew for sure. Did he ever come back? No. Mrs. Callahan's voice grew soft. Never saw him again. The house stood empty for almost a year before your grandparents moved in. They never spoke about Maverick either, acted like he'd never existed. Grace opened the journal, showing Mrs. Callahan the handwriting inside. I found this hidden in the house. He writes about being afraid, about keeping secrets. The elderly woman adjusted her glasses, peering at the pages. Wouldn't surprise me if there was more to the story than anyone knew. Those were complicated times, Grace. People did what they had to do, even if others didn't understand. They talked for another hour, Mrs. Callahan sharing memories of the war years, the blackout curtains, the letters from overseas, the celebrations when victory was finally declared. But she had no more concrete information about Maverick or the mysterious soldier who'd stayed with him. As Grace stood to leave, Mrs. Callahan caught her hand. Your uncle was a good man, Grace. Whatever happened, whatever sent him away, I believe he was trying to do right by someone who needed help. The night air had grown cooler when Grace and Buddy started back toward home. Stars sparkled overhead, countless pinpoints of light in the velvet darkness. Crickets still chirped their evening song, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Grace hugged the journal to her chest as she walked, its leather cover warm against her skin. The mystery of Maverick Whitmore seemed to grow deeper with every new piece of information she uncovered. A kind man who taught boys carpentry, a secret keeper who vanished without a trace, an uncle her parents had erased from family history. Looking up at the star-filled sky, Grace whispered, "Who were you?" Buddy padded silently beside her, his fur ghostly in the starlight, as if he too wondered about the man whose secret room he'd helped uncover. The farmhouse waited ahead, its dark windows holding decades of unspoken stories within its walls. The morning sun filtered through the crack in the hidden doorway as Grace settled onto an old wooden chair in the chamber. Dust motes danced in the beam of light, and she had to squint to make out the faded handwriting in Maverick's journal. She'd brought a thermos of coffee and some cookies, preparing for a long morning of reading. Buddy lay at her feet, his golden fur collecting cobwebs as he dozed. The room felt different in daylight, less mysterious, but somehow more sacred. Grace had positioned a battery-powered lantern nearby for extra light, its glow casting warm shadows on the walls. She opened the journal carefully, mindful of its age. The pages were yellow and brittle, threatening to crumble at the edges. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned to where she'd left off the night before. The entry was dated June 15, 1944. David's cough is worse today. The damp weather isn't helping. and I worry someone will hear him through the walls. But what choice do we have? The world isn't ready to understand. They'd never accept a man like him deserting his unit, especially not for the reasons he did. So we hide, and I pray each day for his safety. Grace's breath caught. She read the name again, David Harper. The handwriting grew more urgent in the following pages, as if Maverick had. Then writing in haste, they're asking questions in town. Mrs. Peterson saw David through the window yesterday and wondered why a supposedly injured soldier looked so healthy now. I made excuses about a miraculous recovery, but her eyes were suspicious. We'll have to be more careful. Grace sipped her coffee, now growing cold, as she continued reading. The entries painted a picture of mounting tension and fear, but also of deep devotion. Maverick wrote about late-night conversations with David, about sharing meals and dreams of a future they could never have openly. Sometimes I imagine a world where we could live without hiding. One entry read, where David could walk down Main Street holding my hand, where we could build a life together in the light instead of the shadows. But that's not our world, not yet. For now, we have these stolen moments, these precious hours behind closed doors. Her hands shaking slightly, Grace turned another page. A photograph slipped out, landing face down on her lap. When she picked it up, her heart seemed to stop for a moment. The image showed Maverick, young, handsome, with the same Whitmore eyes she saw in the mirror, holding a baby. The child was wrapped in a white blanket, tiny fists reaching toward the camera. She turned the photo over slowly, her fingers tracing the familiar handwriting on the back. Her mother's neat script read, "For my brother's child." The date beneath it was 1945. "Oh my God," Grace whispered. Buddy lifted his head at her voice, ears perking up. The journal entries following the photo's date became more desperate. The baby complicates everything. We never meant for this to happen, never planned for Sarah to become involved. But when she offered to help, to give the child a chance at a normal life, how could we refuse? David says we should leave, disappear somewhere no one knows us. He's right, it's too dangerous to stay. Someone will eventually realize the truth. Grace's mind raced. Sarah, that must have been the woman who helped them. But who was she? And what happened to the baby? She read on, the entries growing shorter and more scattered, made arrangements. The house in Cedar Rapids is ready. Sarah says she'll make sure the baby is safe, that no one will ever know. It breaks my heart to leave, but we have no choice. David says we'll start fresh out west, where no one knows our names or our story. The next entry was tear-stained, the ink blurred. Forgive me, little one. I hope someday you'll understand why we had to go. Know that you were loved, are loved, more than you'll ever know. Your father wanted so badly to keep you, to watch you grow. But this world isn't ready. Maybe someday you'll find these words and know the truth. Until then, be safe, be happy, be loved. Grace sat back, her body feeling heavy, her mind struggling to process what she discovered. The dust-filled chamber suddenly seemed too small, too close. Buddy whined softly, pressing his wet nose against her hand. Maverick had a child, her cousin. A baby born in secret, given away to protect both the child and the two men who loved each other in a time when such love was forbidden. The weight of this revelation pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. She stared at the photo again, at the tender way Maverick held the baby, at the mix of joy and sadness in his eyes. All these years, her family had kept this secret. All these years, she'd had a cousin somewhere in the world, never knowing they existed. Grace sat there on the dusty floor, surrounded by the physical remnants of a love story that had been hidden away for decades. The morning light had shifted, casting long shadows across the chamber, but she barely noticed. Her world had shifted too, expanded to include this new branch of her family tree, this hidden history that changed everything she thought she knew about her past. The old farmhouse creaked around her, as if acknowledging the weight of its long-held secrets finally coming to light. The old farmhouse settled into its nightly creaks and whispers as Grace sat at the kitchen table, her laptop casting a blue glow across her tired face. Daniel's soft snoring drifted down from upstairs, where he'd fallen asleep clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur. Buddy lay curled at her feet, occasionally twitching in his dreams. Grace took another sip of chamomile tea, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The journal lay open beside her, its pages marked with sticky notes where she'd found important details. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed Cedar Rapids Adoption Records, 1945 into the search bar. The first few results were generic historical archives, but as she dug deeper, she found a database of county records that had been digitized. Her heart quickened as she clicked through the pages, scanning for anything that might match Maverick's notes. A notification popped up, requesting a subscription fee for full access. Grace bit her lip, glancing at her worn wallet on the counter. Money was tight, but this wasn't a moment to hesitate. She entered her credit card information, watching as the loading bar inched across the screen. "Please," she whispered, "give me something." The database opened, revealing rows of faded documents. Grace's eyes burned from staring at the screen, but she couldn't stop. She cross-referenced dates from Maverick's journal, looking for any adoption records from the summer of 1945. After 2 hours of searching, she found it, a single entry that made her breath catch. A baby, gender not specified, surrendered for adoption on July 15, 1945. The birth parent information was largely redacted, but one detail stood out. The child had been born in a private residence, not a hospital, with a midwife named Sarah Henderson present. Sarah, the same name from Maverick's journal. Grace's hand shook as she clicked through to related documents. The adoption had been processed through a local church organization, St. Michael's Home for Children. Additional records showed the child had been placed with a family in Johnson County, just one county over. She grabbed her notebook, scribbling down details as she found them. The adoptive parents' names were blacked out, but their address was listed as Rural Route 3. The baby had been given a new name, though only the first initial R was visible in the partially redacted document. "Come on," Grace muttered, scrolling faster. "Give me more." A link led her to more recent records. Her heart pounded as she realized the trail hadn't gone cold. There were driver's license renewals, property records, even a marriage certificate from 1967. The person, her cousin, had lived an entire life while their true identity remained hidden. Grace's eyes widened as she found a current address listing from just 5 years ago. Her cousin was still alive, living less than 100 miles away. Beneath the address was a phone number, added to the public record in 2018. Her hands trembled as she reached for her cell phone. The numbers on the screen blurred as tears filled her eyes. What would she say? How do you tell someone their entire family history might be different than they believed? Buddy stirred at her feet, sensing her tension. He pressed his warm body against her legs as she took a deep breath and began dialing. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. Then, a mechanical voice. "We're sorry, but the number you have dialed has been disconnected or is no longer in service. Please check the number and try again." Grace's heart sank. She lowered the phone slowly, staring at the screen as if willing it to show her another way forward. "Don't let this be the end," she whispered into the quiet kitchen. "Please don't let this be the end." The disconnected numbers seemed to mock her, a dead end after coming so close. But as Laking that waters, she looked at Maverick's journal. At the photo of him holding that precious baby, she knew she couldn't give up. Somewhere out there was a person who shared her blood, who deserved to know the truth about their father's love and sacrifice. The old farmhouse creaked again, its walls holding decades of secrets still waiting to be uncovered. Grace sat in the dim kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of discoveries yet to come. "Don't let this be the end," she whispered again, her voice barely audible in the night stillness. Sunlight streamed through the farmhouse windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. Grace sat at the kitchen table, stirring her coffee absently while staring at the disconnected phone number from last night. Daniel had already left for school on the morning bus, leaving her alone with her thoughts and a very energetic Buddy. "Maybe we missed something," she said aloud, watching Buddy tilt his head at her voice. "What do you think, boy? Should we look around some more?" Buddy's tail wagged enthusiastically, and he trotted toward the stairs. Grace couldn't help but smile. His excitement was contagious. She set down her coffee mug and followed him up the creaking steps. The second floor held 3 bedrooms and a narrow staircase leading to the attic. Buddy bounded ahead, his nails clicking against the wooden steps. The attic door stuck slightly, and Grace had to push with her shoulder to open it. Dust motes danced in the beams of light, filtering through the small window. The attic smelled of old wood and memories, filled with trunks, boxes, and furniture draped in yellowed sheets. Buddy moved purposefully through the space, weaving between stacked chairs and old picture frames. Suddenly, he stopped at a corner near the chimney and began scratching frantically at the floorboards. His behavior reminded Grace of how he'd found the hidden room downstairs. "What is it, Buddy?" Grace moved closer, pushing aside several heavy trunks that blocked her path. The wood beneath them was darker than the surrounding floor, suggesting they hadn't been moved in decades. Buddy's pawing grew more insistent. Grace knelt beside him, running her hands over the boards. There, a slight gap between 2 planks, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Her heart racing, Grace retrieved a flathead screwdriver from the toolbox she'd brought upstairs. It took several minutes of careful prying, but finally, the board came loose. Beneath it was a small space between the joists, and tucked inside was a yellowed envelope. Grace's hands trembled as she lifted it out. Written in familiar handwriting, Maverick's handwriting, were the words, "For my daughter, if ever found." "Oh my God," Grace whispered. Buddy pressed against her side as she carefully opened the envelope, trying not to tear the fragile paper. Inside was a letter, dated December 25, 1945. The paper was thin, like onion skin, and Grace had to hold it carefully to keep it from tearing. "My dearest daughter," she read aloud, her voice catching. "If you are reading this, then somehow, against all odds, you have found your way back to this house and to the truth of your beginning." Grace settled onto an old trunk, Buddy lying at her feet as she continued reading. "I want you to know that giving you up was the hardest choice I've ever made. Your father, David Harper, was the love of my life. We met during the darkest days of the war when he sought shelter here after being injured. In those months we spent together, we created something beautiful, you. But these were dangerous times for people like us. Two men in love wasn't something the world was ready to accept. When you were born, we knew we couldn't keep you safe. The scandal would have destroyed not just us, but you as well. David and I made the heartbreaking decision to give you a chance at a normal life. Sarah Henderson, our dear friend and midwife, helped arrange your adoption through Street Michael's Home for Children in Morgan City. The last we knew, you were with a family there. I've written this letter 1,000 times in my head over the years. Each time, I hope to find the right words to explain why we had to let you go. But perhaps there are no right words for such things. Only the truth of a father's love, which never dimmed despite the distance between us. If you're reading this, know that you were wanted. You were loved. Every day of my life, I've carried you in my heart. Your father David passed away in 1963. He never stopped thinking of you either. Before he died, he asked me to make sure you knew that his greatest regret was not being able to watch you grow up. I'm leaving this letter here, in this house where you began, hoping that somehow, someday, you might find your way back to your history. To understand that you came from love, even if it was a love that had to remain hidden. With all my heart, your father, Maverick Whitmore. Tears streamed down Grace's face as she finished reading. Buddy whined softly, placing his head in her lap. She stroked his fur absently, her other hand clutching the precious letter. The morning light had shifted, casting new shadows in the attic. Grace could almost feel Maverick's presence, his love and regret filling the space around her. He had wanted his story found. He had left breadcrumbs, hoping that someday the truth would come to light. Morgan City. The name stood out in her mind. It wasn't far, less than an hour's drive. Was that where Maverick's child had grown up, where they might still be living? Grace carefully folded the letter, her tears leaving small spots on the aged paper. In her mind, she could see Maverick climbing these same attic stairs, hiding away this piece of his heart, praying it would somehow find its way to his daughter. She held the letter close to her chest, feeling the weight of its revelations. This wasn't just a family secret anymore. It was a love story, tragic and beautiful, waiting all these years to be told. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the dashboard as Grace guided their old sedan down Route 37. Daniel sat in the back seat with Buddy, both of them watching the scenery roll past, farmland giving way to small towns, then back to farmland again. "How much longer, Mom?" Daniel asked, scratching behind Buddy's ears. "About 20 minutes to Morgan City," Grace replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. She'd been up half the night, reading and rereading Maverick's letter, practicing what she might say when, if, they found his daughter. Buddy's tail thumped against the seat as they passed a sign welcoming them to Morgan City, population 4,823. The town looked frozen in time, with its brick buildings and vintage storefronts that could have been straight out of an old photograph. "Let's grab some lunch first," Grace suggested, spotting a diner called May's Kitchen. Her stomach was in knots, but Daniel needed to eat, and she could use a few more minutes to collect her thoughts. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. The diner smelled of coffee and fresh baked pie, and a fan spun lazily overhead. They slid into a red vinyl booth, Buddy settling at their feet. While Daniel studied the menu with intense concentration, Grace pulled out her notebook. She'd written several versions of what she might say, but none of them felt right. How do you tell someone you've discovered their long-lost father's secret past? "Welcome to May's," their waitress said, her name tag reading Betty. "What can I get for you folks?" "Cheeseburger and chocolate milk," Daniel announced before Grace could speak. Grace managed a smile. "The same for me, but coffee instead of milk, please." As Betty walked away, Grace turned to a fresh page in her notebook. "Excuse me," she practiced under her breath. "I'm looking for information about an adoption from 1945. Mom?" Daniel's voice pulled her from her rehearsal. "Are you okay? You look worried." Grace reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I'm just nervous, honey. We might find out something really important today." "About the mystery man, Maverick?" "Yes, about Maverick. And maybe about his daughter, who would be my cousin." Their food arrived, and Grace forced herself to eat, knowing she'd need the energy. Daniel chatted about school and his friends, filling the silence with comfortable chatter while Grace continued making notes between bites. After lunch, they drove to the county records office, a stern-looking brick building with white columns. Grace took a deep breath, straightening her shirt before leading Daniel and Buddy up the steps. Inside, the air conditioning hummed quietly, and their footsteps echoed on the tile floor. A clerk looked up from her computer, raising an eyebrow at Buddy but saying nothing. "How can I help you?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. Grace cleared her throat. "I'm researching a family adoption from 1945. The child was placed through Street Michael's Home for Children." "That's quite a while ago," the clerk said, but she was already typing. "Do you have any specific information?" Grace pulled out Maverick's letter. The birth father was Maverick Whitmore. The adoption would have been finalized in December of 45 or early 46. The clerk's fingers moved across the keyboard. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Daniel wandered around the waiting area with Buddy, looking at the historical photographs on the walls. "Ah," the clerk finally said, "I have something." There was an adoption matching those details. The child was renamed Margaret Harper. Grace's heart skipped a beat. Harper, David's surname. Even in giving their daughter up, they'd managed to keep that connection. "Is there?" Grace hesitated, hardly daring to hope. "Is there any current information?" The clerk studied her screen. "Usually, we can't release that kind of information without proper documentation. However," she glanced at Grace's anxious face, then at Daniel and Buddy. Something in her expression softened. "The most recent address we have is actually quite recent. She lives in Millbrook, just 2 towns over." Grace's hands trembled as the clerk wrote down the address. Margaret Harper, Millbrook. It seemed impossible that after all these years, all the secrets and hiding, Maverick's daughter could be so close. "Thank you," Grace whispered, clutching the piece of paper. "Thank you so much." Back in the car, Grace sat behind the wheel, staring at the address through tears that wouldn't stop coming. Daniel climbed into the front seat, Buddy following to squeeze between them. "Did we find her, Mom?" Daniel asked softly. Grace nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The paper trembled in her hands as she read the address again. 47 Maple Street, Millbrook. "We found her," she finally whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We actually found her." Buddy pressed his warm body against her side, offering silent comfort as he had through every discovery. The address seemed to pulse in her hands like a living thing, like a key unlocking the final door to Maverick's secret past. The afternoon sun slanted through the windshield, warming Grace's face as she sat there, overwhelmed by how close they were to completing the puzzle Maverick had left behind. Just 2 towns over, his daughter, the baby he'd given up to protect, the child he'd never stopped loving, was living her life. Perhaps unaware of the beautiful, heartbreaking story of her true beginnings, Grace's old station wagon pulled up to 47 Maple Street, its tires crunching on the gravel driveway. The modest white house sat nestled behind a garden bursting with late summer blooms. Marigolds, black-eyed Susans, and purple coneflowers lined a neat brick path to the front porch. "It's pretty," Daniel whispered, pressing his face against the car window. Grace's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. "Yes, it is." She took several deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart. Buddy whined softly from the backseat, his tail thumping against the upholstery. Grace gathered Maverick's journal, the locket, and the letter, tucking them carefully into her bag. "Ready?" she asked Daniel, who nodded eagerly. They walked up the brick path together, Buddy padding along beside them. The porch steps creaked under their feet. Grace noticed wind chimes tinkling softly, and several well-tended potted plants arranged near a comfortable-looking rocking chair. Her hand shook as she reached for the brass knocker. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet afternoon air. Daniel slipped his small hand into hers while they waited. After what felt like forever, the door opened. A woman in her late 70s stood there, her silver hair neatly styled, wearing a floral blouse and khaki pants. Her eyes, a striking shade of blue, widened slightly at the sight of visitors. "Yes?" she asked, her voice gentle but cautious. Can I help you? Grace swallowed hard. Are you Margaret Harper? I am, the woman replied, her expression growing more guarded. And you are? My name is Grace Whitmore. This is my son Daniel and our dog Buddy. Grace's voice trembled slightly. I found something that belongs to you. Something about your father. Margaret's hand tightened on the doorframe. My father? I'm sorry, but I think you must be mistaken. I never knew my father. Please, Grace said softly, reaching into her bag. Just look at these. She pulled out Maverick's journal first, showing Margaret the name on the cover. Then the locket, its silver surface catching the afternoon light. Finally, the letter addressed for my daughter, if ever found. Margaret's hands trembled as she took the items, her eyes filled with tears as she opened the locket, revealing the photographs inside. Come in, she whispered, stepping back from the door. Please, come in. They followed her into a cozy living room filled with family photos and handmade quilts. Margaret sank into an armchair, already reading Maverick's letter with shaking hands. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she learned the truth, about Maverick, about David Harper, about the love story that had led to her birth. When she finished reading, Margaret looked up at Grace with wonder in her tear-filled eyes. She rose from her chair and stepped onto the porch, drawing both Grace and Daniel into a tight embrace. I always wondered who I really was, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Sunlight streamed through the farmhouse windows as Grace led Margaret into the once hidden chamber. The space had been transformed over the past few days. Fresh lamps cast a warm glow, and Grace had carefully cleaned away decades of dust. The old furniture now gleamed, telling silent stories of the past. It's so strange, Margaret said, running her fingers along the polished table where Maverick's journal had rested. To think my father sat here, writing about his hopes and fears. Daniel brought in a tray with teacups while Buddy trotted behind him, tail wagging. The dog settled at their feet as they gathered around the small table. Tell me more about your life, Grace encouraged, pouring steaming tea into delicate cups she'd found in the kitchen cabinets. Margaret's eyes grew distant with memories. I had wonderful adopted parents, she began. But there was always this emptiness. Questions no one could answer. She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I became a teacher, married a kind man who passed away 10 years ago. We couldn't have children of our own, which somehow made the mystery of my birth feel even heavier. Daniel reached over and patted Margaret's hand. But now you're stale. Our grandmother, he said with the simple wisdom of a child. Margaret's face lit up with joy. Yes, I suppose I am. Grace watched them together, her heart full. The past week had changed everything, not just uncovering family secrets, but finding a connection she hadn't known she was missing. In Margaret, she'd found both a cousin and a mother figure, someone who understood the weight of uncertainty and the joy of discovery. You know, Grace said softly, this house felt so empty when we first arrived, but now it's full of family, Margaret finished, smiling. Buddy stretched contentedly at their feet as they shared stories over tea, the afternoon light warming the chamber that had held secrets for so long. Grace glanced at the doorway, remembering how it had been sealed away, hiding truths that needed to be found. The past brought us here, she whispered, her eyes bright with happiness, but the future is ours to build. If even one moment stayed with you, hit subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another story written gently for the heart.